to the first-class societies c. 3000–1000 BC the pharaoh Menkaure with two goddesses in attendance. Grey stone sculpture, Egypt, c. 2500 BC. World's FRST-class societies were ruled by autocrats who combined the roles of god, priest, judge, and war leader. In certain parts of the world, from around 3000 BC, especially in the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Pakistan, and China, the first fully formed class societies emerged. Priests, war leaders, and civil officials used their positions to monopolize control over surpluses, impose their authority on the rest of society, and begin to exploit the labor of others in their own interest. In this period, known to archaeologists as the Bronze Age, metals were used to fashion weapons, ornaments, and trinkets, but the main tools of everyday labor continued to be made of stone, wood, and bone. Because of this, productivity remained low and surpluses small. The spread of civilization was limited, and while empires rose and fell, most of humanity continued to live beyond their reach. Owing to the conservatism of the Bronze Age elites, technical innovation occurred on the periphery of the world system rather than at its core, and by c. 1000 BC, one such innovation was helping to topple the old empires and start an economic revolution: ironworking. The first ruling class prehistoric Sumer, a tract of land in the Tigris-Euphrates delta of southern Iraq, was made up of swamp and desert. But here, by c. 3000 BC, Neolithic pioneers had created a real-life version of the mythic Garden of Eden. They drained the swamps and irrigated the sandbanks between them. In doing so, they created fields of exceptional fertility. By 2500 BC, the average yield on a field of barley was 86 times the sowing. We know this from written records inscribed on baked clay tablets. The Sumerians had invented writing because the complex, urban, class-based society they created required them to maintain detailed records, especially records of tax and other dues. Ancient Sumer was roughly the size of modern Denmark. Once its rich soils were under cultivation, it could produce massive agricultural surpluses. These made possible a qualitative shift from living in villages to living in towns. Sumer accomplished what the great interwar archaeologist Gordon Childe called the urban revolution. The main archaeological markers of this revolution are the tells of Sumer and other parts of the Middle East. Flat-topped artificial mounds formed by thousands of years of settlement. Layers of soil representing leveled, mud brick buildings tell the story of successive generations of inhabitants. They show Copper Age villages expanding into Bronze Age cities between the 4th and 3rd millennium BC. Excavations have revealed cities dominated by large temples and artificial mounds known as ziggurats. At Erech, a ziggurat of early dynastic date c. 2900–2300 BC was 10 meter high. built of sun-dried bricks, faced with thousands of pottery goblets, and topped by an asphalt platform. The city as a whole, with its residential and industrial districts, covered 5 square kilometers. The temples and the estates in the surrounding countryside that supported them belonged to the gods. The territory of Lagash was divided among some 20 deities. The goddess Bao owned 44 square kilometers. Some of this was allocated to individual families, and some was worked as Bao's personal estate by wage laborers, tenant farmers, or clansmen doing customary labor service. In the absence of Bao herself, the property was managed on her behalf by temple priests. Many of Bao's people held only 0.321 ha of land, but one high temple official is known to have held 14.4 ha. So the priests formed a social elite, with both collective control over the wealth of temple estates and private wealth from their own estates. Wealth made them powerful, and their power was used to accumulate more wealth. A decree aimed to restore the old order of Lagash, as it had existed from the beginning. It records that priests were stealing from the poor, practicing various kinds of extortion, and treating temple land, cattle, equipment, and servants as their private property or slaves. From the ranks of the priests came city governors, later styled kings. At Lagash, the city governor was both high priest of the chief god and commander-in-chief of the citizen army. He enjoyed the use of 246 ha of Bao's estate. The city governor of Lagash was one of many rulers, for Sumer was divided into separate city-states. These were often at war. The standard of Ur, a highly decorated box from a royal tomb dating to around 2600 BC, depicts 4-wheeled chariots trampling enemies, spearmen wearing helmets and metal-studded cloaks, and naked prisoners in front of the king. Each polity lived in fear of its neighbors. Each had land, flocks, granaries, treasure, and a workforce to protect. Military power was imperative for defense. But military power, once acquired, could be used proactively. Preemptive aggression might be the best guarantee of future security. Predatory aggression might enhance the wealth and power of a ruler. Military power also had an internal function. The state, the ruler, the priests, a bureaucracy of officials and clerks, and the armed bodies of men they commanded, was a mechanism for maintaining the new social order of the city. Bureaucracy was itself an instrument of class power. The complexity of urban society demanded writing for record-keeping, standardized weights and measures for trade, and geometry and arithmetic for land measurement. In an increasingly complex and class-dominated society, who owed what to who needed to be measured, written down, and enforced. New sorts of specialists were trained in these arts. Their education was esoteric and exclusive. The state hierarchy imbued them with authority and status. Older categories of specialists, traders and artisans, were also embedded in the new class structure. There was no free market. The economy of the ancient city was rooted in the political order. Rulers controlled what was traded, where it was sold, and by whom. In particular, they maintained a monopoly of metals, especially bronze and gold. Early dynastic Sumer, in short, was the world's first fully developed class society. At the bottom were slaves. Above them were commoners of subordinate status. Above these were free citizens. One baked clay tablet refers to 205 slave girls and children, probably employed in a centralized weaving establishment. Another describes the occupational hierarchy at the temple of Bao in Lagash. At the top were clerks, officials, and priests. At the bottom were bakers, brewers, and textile workers, many of them women, many of them slaves. The houses excavated at Eshner reveal clear class differences. The larger houses on the main roads occupied 200 square meters or more. But smaller houses, often only 50 square meters and lining narrow alleys, were far more numerous. Class inequality was resented and resisted. Sumerian tablets allude to the tensions. The new social order was not based on consensus. It had to be imposed and maintained by force. How had the minority acquired the power to elevate itself above the majority? What enabled the few to accumulate wealth at the expense of the many? Class is both a social relationship between rich and poor, and an economic process of exploitation and surplus accumulation. It has to be continually reproduced. And because it is contested, it involves class struggle. The rulers' strive for wealth and power gain traction from the combination of poverty and property, a combination that holds all pre-industrial class societies in a vice-like grip. Poverty is a general condition. Traditional agricultural economies do not produce enough to provide abundance for all. Sometimes they do not produce enough to provide even the necessities. Property is a privileged, a priori claim to scarce resources. It allocates wealth to certain individuals, families, landowners, temples, tribes, or city-states. Property can be private or collective, but is never universal. This contradictory pairing, poverty and property, gave rise to class inequality, state power, and warfare. The religious and military specialists of prehistoric Sumer had been granted control over the surplus so that they could carry out their functions on behalf of society as a whole. At first, their position had depended on public sanction, but control over surplus made them powerful, and as they consolidated their authority, they found that they could use it to enrich themselves further and maintain their position without public sanction. In this way, the high priests, war chiefs, city governors, and petty kings of urban Sumer evolved into an exploitative ruling class accumulating and consuming surplus in its own interest. A power over society, no longer a power of society. To spread of civilization, something similar occurred at around the same time or somewhat later in several other places. Civilization did not spread outwards from a single center. It arose independently where circumstances made it possible. In Sumer, priests formed the core of the ruling class. Temple estates provided their wealth, and temple ziggurats their most imposing monuments. City governors and war leaders were recruited from the theocracy. In Egypt, the rivers was through. Mans, chief of the Falcon clan and legendary first pharaoh, united the Nile Delta, Lower Egypt, and the Nile Valley, Upper Egypt, by military conquest. Having created a centralized state, he proclaimed himself a god-king pharaoh. Priests, officials, merchants, artisans, and peasants were all subordinate to the pharaoh. The ruling class, priests and officials, owed their estates and position to royal patronage. The pyramids, iconic monuments of Old Kingdom Egypt, 2700–2250 BC, were not temples, but royal tombs. Like the Sumerian priests and city governors, the pharaohs fostered the cultural prerequisites of the urban revolution. Irrigation works, long-distance trade, especially in metals, timber, and stone, literacy and record-keeping, numerical notation and geometry, standard weights and measures, the calendar and timekeeping, and the science of astronomy. This urban package reflected the needs of the state and the elite. Control of the waters of the Nile ensured abundant harvests, large surpluses, and a healthy workforce. Official trade missions secured the raw materials needed for arms manufacture, monumental architecture, and luxury consumption. A literate and numerate bureaucracy managed the tribute and labor services on which state power depended. Independent urban revolutions occurred in several other places. This shows that all humans are capable of the highest achievements. There are no superior races or nations that give the lead to the rest. It is culture and circumstance, not biology, that determine historical differences. Around 2600 BC, urban civilization emerged in the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan. The great monuments and residential suburbs of Mohenjo-Daro cover 2.6 square kilometers. The walled perimeter of Harappa is 4 kilometers long. Inscribed seal stamps and standard weights and measures indicate complex administration. Ancient Niai in the Yellow River region of northern China was an unwalled complex measuring almost 10 kilometers in length by 4 km in width. It was probably the capital of the Shang dynasty in the 13th century BC. Excavations have revealed rich royal tombs, great caches of decorated bronzes, and tens of thousands of cracked and inscribed oracle bones. If we glance forward in time, we see the same pattern elsewhere. Teotihuacan in Mexico, at its peak between 450 and 650, was a city of 20 square km and around 150,000 people. At its center was a monumental complex dominated by giant pyramids. The Pyramid of the Sun is 210 square meters at the base and 64 meter high. Great Zimbabwe, at 1500 in the heart of Africa, was a city of 20,000 people. Its wealth was based on cattle, crop cultivation, and trade in gold, copper, ivory, and slaves. Its territory extended over 100,000 square km between the rivers Zambezi and Limpopo. It was once believed that civilization was exported from a single center. Scholars wrote them, light from the ancient East. This fitted with 19th century notions of the white man's burden, the civilizing mission of European imperialists. Archaeology has demonstrated something different. Civilization developed independently at different places at different times. The message is that all people share a common humanity and similar creative potential. But the major centers of civilization did have an impact on surrounding societies. There was interaction between core, more advanced metropolitan areas, and periphery, less developed areas economically dependent on them. The Egyptian pharaoh obtained wood from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and gold from Sudan. Sometimes this was a matter of peaceful exchange. The city of Byblos in Lebanon grew rich on the timber trade. Local merchants employed clerks who could read Egyptian. There was cultural interaction, but it could also be a matter of conquest. Northern Sudan was next and forced to pay tribute in gold. The interaction between core and periphery was therefore multifaceted. It had economic, political, military, and cultural dimensions. The demands of trade encouraged merchants, sea captains, and shipbuilders. Longboats powered by rowers were used in the Aegean from c. 3000 BC onwards. The citadel of Troy in 2700 BC, known as Troy II, was built to guard the harbor at the entrance to the Dardanelles in northwestern Turkey. The thalassocracy, sea power of Minos rose to dominance in c. 1950-1450 BC on the basis of Greece's central location in the eastern Mediterranean and the islanders' revolutionary design of deep-hulled, high-capacity, sail-powered cargo ships. The rulers of Minoan Crete lived in sprawling stone palaces decorated with frescoes, and had storerooms packed with giant ceramic containers. The Greek poet Homer, describing Odysseus' travel-worn appearance, says he was like some captain of a merchant crew, who spends his life on a hulking tramp, worrying about his outward freight, or keeping a sharp eye on the cargo when he comes home. With extortionate profits, seafarers and merchants were familiar figures in many Bronze Age societies. Trade drove change on the periphery of the great empires. So, too, did the threat of war. Sargon-of Akkad united the cities of Mesopotamia sometime after 2330 BC. Forging an empire that eventually extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The Old Kingdom pharaohs conquered Sinai for its copper. Threatened by superpower militarism, the minor states and tribes of the periphery therefore organized for war. Warriors, weapons, and war fleets dominated the Bronze Age world. An arms race gathered pace through the centuries. Frescoes depict merchant ships loaded with goods, but also warships filled with armed men. Through trade and war, and by the movement of goods, people, and ideas, the societies of core and periphery influenced one another. The sharing and spreading of culture is what archaeologists call diffusion. It is one of the primary mechanisms by which knowledge and productivity advance. Progress is impeded by barriers and facilitated by bridges. But the world of competing elites and rival armies also harbored the potential for waste and regression. As we shall see, the contradictions of Bronze Age civilization repeatedly plunge humanity into crisis and barbarism. Crisis in the Bronze Age empires rose and fell. The 140-year Akkadian Empire, based in Iraq, collapsed suddenly around 2190 BC. Equally sudden had been the overthrow of the Old Kingdom pharaohs in Egypt a short time before, around 2250 BC. Why did early Bronze Age civilization fail? Detail is lacking, but Egyptian sources record famine, a fragmentation of the state, and incursions by Libyan raiders from the west and Nubians from the south. What is not clear is why these events should have happened. Why was the once strong centralized state of the pyramid builders no longer able to feed the people, enforce its authority, and defend its borders? This pattern of rise and fall repeated itself. New empires emerged from the chaos of the early Bronze Age crisis. Between 1600 and 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was again divided among rival empires. New Kingdom Egypt, the Hittites of Anatolia, Turkey, the Mitanni of northern Mesopotamia, Iraq, and the Mycenaean Greeks. But this late Bronze Age geopolitical system also collapsed amid storm and strife during the 12th century BC. The embattled New Kingdom pharaohs record coordinated attacks by Libyans and northerners coming from all lands. The latter were the more dangerous. The multi-ethnic sea peoples amassed great pirate fleets. All at once, declared Ramses III, these peoples were on the move. No country could stand up to them. Preeminent as seafarers and warriors, Greeks were among these sea peoples. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are probably based on an oral record of real events that took place around 1190 BC. His epics have transformed them into tales of daring do by legendary heroes. The kernel of truth about the Trojan War appears to be that it was a massive seaborne raid by Greek pirates out for plunder. So the late Bronze Age empires collapsed as the early Bronze Age empires had done. And when we look beyond the Mediterranean, to places where civilization developed at different times, we see the same pattern of rise and fall. The Indus civilization of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in Pakistan collapsed around 1900 BC. Excavators found numerous unburied remains of people suddenly and violently killed in the uppermost levels of the great city of Mohenjo-Daro. Chinese history, from the Shang of the 2nd millennium BC to the Manchu of 1644-1911, records the rise and fall of a long succession of imperial dynasties, with occasional periods, sometimes lasting centuries, of division and civil war. Throughout this epoch, despite impressive technical achievements and huge increases in output and population, Chinese civilization remained essentially conservative. The socio economic order simply replicated itself, from generation to generation, from dynasty to dynasty. China provides an extreme example of the cyclical trajectory of ancient civilization. So we have two historical problems. Why did ancient empires rise and fall? And why did this contradictory social form replicate itself over such long periods of time? The ancient world was characterized by stagnation of technique. On several occasions, humans had escaped the contradictions of an existing mode of production, an economic and social system, by transforming it. Climate change had destroyed the habitats of the big game on which upper Paleolithic hunters depended. The response: the agricultural or early Neolithic revolution had achieved massive increases in productivity, output, and population through the adoption of crop cultivation and stock raising. Soil exhaustion and population pressure had later created a crisis for this early Neolithic mode of production. In the late Neolithic and urban revolutions, the contradictions were resolved with the second leap forward, based on land reclamation, irrigation schemes, and plowing. But the urban revolution also erected an impediment to further progress: the existence of a ruling class. We have charted its emergence. We have noted its roots in specialized religious, military, and political functions, and in the shortages and insecurities inherent in a primitive economic system. The first rulers were those whose social roles gave them control over scarce resources. Why should the ruling class have been a barrier to new ideas? Surely it was in their interest to improve techniques in order to increase surplus. Yes and no. As with all things in social life, there were contradictory pressures. The new ruling classes sat uneasy on their thrones. They were divided among themselves, family against family, city against city, tribe against tribe, empire against empire. To overcome domestic rivals, top families had retinues of loyalists and bodyguards. Against foreign enemies, they needed armies and fortresses. The rulers were also divided from the mass of the people, who, because they were exploited, were potentially rebellious and had to be cowed by a judicious combination of force and fraud. Force meant the threat posed by aristocratic retinues and state forces. Fraud meant the ideological claim that the rulers played an essential role and acted in the public interest. Both were embodied in the great monuments that dominate the archaeological record. Take the pyramids of Old Kingdom Egypt. They were the royal tombs of god kings who were expected to live for eternity. Monuments to a false ideology by which the ruler was elevated into a figure of awesome and intimidating power. The pyramids were designed to teach people their place. They were ideological weapons in a class war. So the Bronze Age elites did not invest the surplus they controlled in improved technique and higher productivity. Instead, they squandered resources on military competition, prestige monuments, and, of course, luxury lifestyles. Power, propaganda, and privilege, not productivity, consumed the surpluses created by the labor of Bronze Age peasants. Innovation, indeed, was more likely to be perceived as a threat than an opportunity. The ruling class itself did not get its hands dirty. Productive labor was performed by the common people. For this reason, new inventions, insofar as they appeared at all, were likely to come from below, empowering ordinary people, disrupting established economic arrangements, and perhaps destabilizing the social order. They were therefore viewed with suspicion. Bronze Age rulers were rarely interested in new technology unless it had military applications. Their focus was on accumulating power in a competitive geopolitical system. That is why the greed of the rich was never sated. The grandeur of past monuments set a standard to be surpassed by those who followed. Rulers competed in the luxury of their palaces, the splendor of their tombs, the art and architecture of their great cities. But above all, they competed militarily as rival polities expanded and clashed. A slow-motion arms race could be detected in the late Bronze Age world. There seemed to be more soldiers, better armed, defending stronger fortresses in 1200 BC than there had been in 1600 BC. The world was becoming ever more militarized. Technique was stagnant, therefore, but surplus consumption was rising. War, monuments, and luxury meant higher levels of exploitation were necessary, and overaccumulation at the top was mirrored by the degradation of society's agricultural base. The proud warrior lords of the late Bronze Age were a parasitic social elite whose economic cost was increasingly unsustainable. That is the fundamental reason for the implosion of their world in the 12th century BC. But this was a problem without an internal solution. Stagnant technique meant socio-economic conservatism. There were no new forces developing inside the old society. The choice, therefore, was between the barbarism of invading hordes and the reincarnation of the old, failed imperial civilization. Humanity was again at an impasse. Only this time, the existence of classes and states had raised formidable barriers to human creativity and progress. Excursus 1. How history works. The Bronze Age impasse provides a useful occasion to pause and take stock. All the elements of a complex society are now in place, so it is convenient to ask, how does history work? Three engines drive the historical process. First, there is the development of technique. Progress could be defined as the accumulation of knowledge that makes possible better control over nature, increases in labor productivity, and a bigger store of economic resources available for the satisfaction of human need. Progress in this sense is not inevitable. Entire generations of peasants in, say, Shang China, Mycenae in Greece, or Norman England might live out their entire lives without experiencing a significant innovation in either agriculture or domestic equipment. Only in modern capitalist society is the development of technique inherent in the mode of production. In making this point, Marx explicitly states, conservation of old modes of production in unaltered form was the first condition of existence of all earlier industrial classes. Progress in pre-capitalist society was haphazard, not intrinsic to the dynamic of the socio-economic system. In pre-class society, for example, ecological crisis threatening the survival of human groups was probably of critical significance. The early Neolithic revolution seems to have been a response to climate change and a sharp decline in game. In early class society, on the other hand, the development of technique was subject to a wider variety of influences, some of them catalysts of innovation, others barriers to progress. To understand this, we need to review the other two engines of the historical process. The second engine is competition among rulers for wealth and power. This takes the form of conflict within ruling classes, among rival aristocratic factions, for example, and conflict between ruling classes, as in wars between rival states and empires. In modern capitalist society, such competition has both economic and politico-military dimensions. The two world wars were essentially wars between rival national capitalist blocs. In pre-capitalist class societies, by contrast, competition between rulers was essentially political and took the form of competitive military accumulation. The world was divided into rival factions and polities. Political insecurity was a permanent condition. The result was military competition, a relentless drive to amass soldiers, fortifications, and armaments faster than one's rivals. The third engine of the historical process is the struggle between classes. In the ancient world, competitive military accumulation required the ruling class to increase the rate of exploitation and extract more surplus from the peasantry. But there were two limits to this process. First, the peasantry in the economic system had to be able to reproduce themselves. Overtaxation would, and sometimes did, destroy the material foundations of the social order. The second was the peasants' resistance to exploitation. We know very little about the class struggle in the Bronze Age. One exception is provided by documents of the 2nd millennium BC from Thebes, modern Luxor in Egypt. They concern a community of skilled quarrymen, stonemasons, and carpenters who made the temples and tombs of the elite. These documents record class tension. Though the craftsmen were relatively well paid and worked moderate hours, bullying managers sometimes tried to tighten the screws. On one occasion, those deemed surplus to requirements were made to undertake forced labor. But the exploited sometimes fought back. One of the documents records that, in 1170 BC, backed by their wives, the craftsmen went on strike. the first recorded strike in history, when their rations were delayed and their families faced hunger. So we see three engines of history at work: the development of technique, competition among rival rulers, and the struggle between classes. Each engine is very different. Each operates in a different register, at varying speed, and with intermittent effect. Because of this, the historical process is immensely complex. Not only is each engine itself a nexus of contradictions, but all three engines operate simultaneously, pulling sometimes in the same direction, sometimes in opposite directions. For this reason, each historical situation is unique. Each one is a distinctive conjuncture of economic problems, social tensions, political antagonisms, cultural differences, and personal influences. The conjuncture provides the context in which historical action takes place, but the context does not determine the outcome. It is the clash of social forces, of organized human groups, that decides history's future direction. Let us return to the successive crises of Bronze Age civilization. Waste expenditure drained resources from productive technique and effectively choked off experiment and innovation. More than that, the advance of knowledge was blocked by magic, religion, and other forms of mystification, and by the ruling class's innate suspicion of things they did not understand and feared might prove subversive. Progress is contingent on, through consciousness, knowledge of the world which, because it corresponds with external reality, is an effective guide to human action. False consciousness, belief in God caves, divine inspiration, or the efficacy of ritual, for example, has the opposite effect. It is a barrier to knowledge, to practical work, and therefore to social progress. Instead of theory and practice interacting in the real world to improve technique and productivity, the two, mind and matter, literacy and labor, became separated in the imperial civilizations. Egyptian priests studied the stars, not the soil, and wrote manuals on mummification, not natural science. The wealth produced by Egyptian peasants was wasted on monuments to mysticism. The skills of Egyptian artisans were despised precisely for being manual. So progress was blocked in the old civilizations. No new forces capable of breaking through the impasse were fostered. History's energy was wasted turning the wheel of imperial rise and fall. But if the core of the world system in c. 1200 BC could be seen as a froth of geopolitical turmoil above stagnant depths of socio-economic conservatism, the periphery was more dynamic. Here, relatively free of the control of kings, priests, and bureaucrats, nomads, farmers, and artisans of the wider Bronze Age world were pushing at the limits of knowledge and skill. Many were the innovations, but one was to be of supreme importance. Bronze was expensive, aristocratic, and too soft to make strong tools and weapons. A metal that was cheap, hard, and available to all would conquer the world. Into the storm and strife of the late Bronze Age crisis came new invaders from the north. Men of iron. Many revolutions occur on the periphery rather than at the core of global systems. Life on the periphery is less secure, less entrenched, and therefore less conservative. Manual labor was both exploited and despised in the old imperial civilizations of the Bronze Age. Vast surpluses were extorted and wasted on war, monuments, and luxury. There was little left for investment in new technology and little incentive to use it for that purpose. Innovation involved thought, questioning, imagining new possibilities. So human creativity was not only denied the material resources on which to work, it was also mesmerized by the spells and mysticism of priests. The occasional spark of ingenuity stands out against a backcloth of stagnation. The Egyptians invented glassworking, the Babylonians accounting, the Phoenicians the alphabet. The exceptions to the rule are revealing. A luxury commodity, a way of measuring wealth, and a script for recording it. Such inventions are of little use to farmers or artisans. They concern the consumption and control of wealth, not its production. They reflect a society in which the world of learning was divorced from the world of labor. Not so on the periphery. Here, around 1300 BC, an industrial revolution had begun that was to transform the world. Where exactly it took place we do not know, but it was, for sure, beyond the reach of overmighty rulers. The archaeological record is unequivocal. From this time onwards, the quantity, range, and sophistication of metal objects exploded. Mining technology advanced to provide an ever greater supply of copper, tin, and gold. Smelting technique improved, and metalsmiths began to use multiple molds and the lost wax technique to produce objects of unprecedented complexity. There are bronze figurines of warriors from Sardinia, bronze trumpets from Danish bogs, bronze breastplates molded to look like pectoral muscles, bronze shields, swords, scabbards, spearhead, axes, horse harnesses, knives, and much more. Sometimes it is found in massive hoards. Thousands of late Bronze Age hoards are known to archaeologists. One at Ilam in Cambridgeshire contains 6,500 pieces of metal. Soon something even more momentous occurred. Metal workers started experimenting with ways of extracting iron from its stubbornly intractable ores. Iron was not new. For centuries, crude implements of wrought iron had occasionally been used, but no technique had been developed for the mass production of quality ironwork at an economical cost. This may have been the achievement of a barbarian tribe living in the Caucasus Mountains in remote antiquity. The new technology seems to have spread from there to the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, Turkey. Its further spread was then delayed by the determination of the Hittite imperial ruling class to monopolize iron weaponry. Iron artifacts did not become widespread until after 1200 BC, when ironworking took off amid the collapse of the Bronze Age empires. As it did so, the greatest advances in technique, productivity, and output were registered on the periphery and in the interstices between the great powers. Ironworking launched a chain of economic, social, and political changes. Bronze was expensive and relatively soft, which is why most Bronze Age farmers continued to work with tools of wood and stone. Iron is abundant, cheap, and hard, but the barrier to its use until then had been its high melting point. Smelting required specialized bloomeries, furnaces in which bellows were used to force air through iron ore and charcoal to achieve very high temperatures. Once the technique had been invented, ordinary farmers could build their own bloomeries and equip themselves with metal tools. Anyone who doubts the increase in productivity made possible by iron should try digging clay with a wooden spade or chopping wood with a stone axe. 3,000 years ago, iron revolutionized agriculture, industry, and war. Its impact was as transformative as that of steam power in the 19th century. It also threatened to turn the social world upside down. Bronze was the prerogative of the aristocracy. The Bronze Age world was dominated by chariot-mounted warlords equipped with expensive arms and armor. They were supported by peasant masses bound to ceaseless toil with primitive tools. Iron was the supreme chopper and cutter. Men with iron axes could clear thick forests and jungles to create new farms. Then, with iron plows, they could till heavy clay soils. Iron technology unleashed a new wave of agricultural pioneers and free peasants. Iron was also democratic. The bronzesmiths worked for the palaces, the blacksmiths for the villages. Iron gave the common man a spear, even a sword. If he stood shoulder to shoulder with other men, if he formed a phalanx, he could stop a chariot charge. And if he could do that, he could kill the landlord. The ironworkers of 1000 BC, had they but known it, were smelting revolution. Moving from settlement to settlement in zones ruled by petty chieftains, trading his wares and his skills. The metalsmith of the early Iron Age was the unwitting agent of a new world order. Rival chieftains competed for his services, which raised his economic value, his social standing, and his own valuation of himself and his craft. This, in turn, gave him the rewards, independence, and self-confidence to be an innovator. Homer captures something of this. The Iliad and the Odyssey span 4 centuries. They purport to describe events in the 12th century BC, but they took on their final written form only in the 8th. Sometimes Homer describes the late Bronze Age, sometimes his own archaic age. When he says that a soothsayer, a doctor, a singer, and a craftsman are sure of a welcome everywhere, he tells us how things were in a post-imperial age, in the dark age of the 8th century BC, in a world of petty chieftains and itinerant ironsmiths. The new class of free artisans that first emerged in the barbarian north had, by Homer's time, been long established in the eastern Mediterranean. In the 12th century BC, The late Bronze Age empires had collapsed, exhausted by military struggle against one another, broken by resistance from within and attack from without. The geopolitical system that replaced them was a mosaic of smaller polities, shrunken imperial states like Egypt, mercantile city-states like Ilgarit, and barbarian settlements like Palestine. Ironworking flourished in this new, more open, less top-down world. Cyprus, a center of maritime commerce, pioneered the iron-based industrial revolution of the 12th and 11th centuries BC in the eastern Mediterranean. The old cycle of rise and fall, the recurrent rhythm of Bronze Age civilization, was broken. A new technology was creating a new economy, new social relationships, and new political forms. History was carving out fresh channels,